So with that, I would like to introduce our petitioners, and I'm going to, there we go, get to the first slide. And so I would like to introduce Heather Govern, the Director of the Clean Water Program for the Conservation Law Foundation, and Jen Duggan, the Vermont Director for the Conservation Law Foundation. Thank you. And bear with me as I pass the clip here. Okay.
Good morning. My name is Jen Duggan, and I'm the director of CLF Vermont. I'm going to spend a couple of moments talking about some background on PFAS, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Heather Govern to talk about our petition and kind of walk through what we're asking the department to do with respect to drinking water standards for PFAS. So PFAS are a pretty unique class of compounds, and that's really why we're here today. They are the public health perfect storm. They are persistent in the environment, which means that they just don't break down. They're highly mobile in water. They move quickly, through water, through groundwater, surface water, which means that the contamination can spread easier. They're bioaccumulative. They're toxic in very small quantities. So normally when we talk about pollution, we're talking about parts per billion. These compounds are toxic in parts per trillion. They're found in hundreds of different products. So there are multiple pathways that PFAS enter the environment. And there are thousands of different compounds. There are between 3,000 and 5,000 different compounds in the PFAS class. I just want to hit on a couple of key points, I think, with respect to why these chemicals are so unique and pose such a risk to public health. The first is that they are found in many different consumer products, and they're used in lots of different applications. So with respect to consumer products, they are in nonstick cookware, they're in stain-resistant fabrics, they're in fast food packaging, and even our dental floss. They're in paints. They are really in a lot of different consumer products. And what that means is that we are using those products and we dispose of those products in landfills. So that's a pathway there. And then we are actually coming into contact or eating off of products that contain PFAS, and so that's another potential pathway for exposure. They are used in a lot of different types of industrial sources. So we've listed a few on the slide here, but that's not all. So when you're thinking about how chemicals enter the environment, and you have a chemical that's used in lots of different types of manufacturing process and different businesses, there's a potential for each of those businesses to be a source of contamination. The other thing we'll mention too, I think, that we've touched on already is AFFF foam that's used in fire departments, at military bases, at airports. So it really is widespread and multiple pathways to come into contact with humans. I guess the other thing I'll mention too is that I think that we're seeing in other states sort of surprising areas of contamination. Like in Vermont, they've identified PFAS contamination in school drinking water, and there's no manufacturing source around. And the theory is that the chemical products that were disposed of down the drain went into the septic system and contaminated a drinking water well. So that's not, when you think about a contaminated site, you're not normally thinking about a school. And so that really highlights the scope of the challenge that this poses for federal and state regulators. We know that PFAS is in landfill leachate that's sent to wastewater treatment plants that can't effectively treat it, and it ends up in sludge, which is oftentimes land applied. So the scope of the problem is significant. It really highlights the need for federal and state regulators to be thinking outside of the box in terms of what are potential sources, and the need for a really comprehensive sampling plan by states to make sure that they're doing the work to protect public health and identify all the different potential sources of PFAS in their state. The other thing I'll touch on with respect to what makes this, unique is that, these chemicals are toxic in very small quantities. Like I said, parts per trillion, and we've listed off a couple of the adverse health outcomes, which include certain types of cancer, compromises to the immune system, and decreased antibody response to vaccines, thyroid disease, liver damage. There are lots of, adverse health effects associated with these compounds. And we know that there are thousands of these compounds. Only a few have been studied in terms of the potential for health impacts. There's a lot of conversation about, we don't know what the toxicity is for these other compounds that we haven't studied. And it's very resource intensive to look at one chemical and understand what the toxicity is, what the human health impacts are, much less do that for thousands of chemicals. But we do know they're similar in chemical structure. Scientists are now coming together to say, hey, we know about this small group of compounds. We know that they're similar in chemical structure, and we have no evidence to suggest that these other ones are safe. So we really believe that because of the unique challenges that this class of compounds poses, we need to be thinking about PFAS as a class and how to protect the public from exposure to the class of PFAS compounds. We will never catch up if we do chemical by chemical by chemical. So the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Heather is that, we feel that states are the last line of defense. EPA has repeatedly dropped the ball when it comes to protecting public health from PFAS. They were aware of the potential risk associated with PFAS back in the late 90s, early 2000s, yet they gave chemical manufacturers over a decade to phase out these compounds. They are continuing to approve new PFAS as we speak to be allowed into the marketplace and into the environment. And they've attempted to suppress reports that show that their health advisory is actually is not as protective as it should be. And with respect to drinking water standards, they've said that they're considering setting a drinking water standard for PFOA and PFOS. That's 2 out of the thousands of PFAS compounds. And even if they do act, they've acknowledged that it will take years for them to set those standards. So we recognize the unique challenges that this places on state regulators to do this work. This is the scope of the problem is significant. But states are really the last line of defense to protect public health. And they do have, both the authority under state statute and the obligation to make sure that we all have access to safe and clean drinking water. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather to talk in detail about the petition.
Thank you, Jen. Can everybody hear me? Hi, I'm Heather Govern. I'm the director of the Clean Water Program and the Enforcement Program at CLF Conservation Law Foundation. I am based here in the Boston office. And just carrying on from Jen's points regarding why it's important that the standard for PFAS and the protective standard be for the entire class of PFAS. what needs to be understood, and Jen sort of alluded to it, was that the companies that create these products are able to slightly tweak their compounds and then roll out new chemicals year after year, decade after decade. This has been going on for a while. And that's why it's very difficult and would prove difficult for any state agency and even for EPA to actually regulate each individual compound. So everyone had access, I believe, to the petition itself, and I don't want to really bore all of you with each and every detail, but the main points in what we're asking for is that MassDEP, at a minimum and immediately, adopt at least a 20 part per trillion standard for 5 PFAS. And that's because there's sometimes this work takes some time to put together an actual standard and also allow the public to comment on that. But because this is such a public health crisis at the moment, we're asking for something to be done immediately. And but to work on and for the afterwards, adopting a treatment technique standard that actually protects the public from the PFAS class. And if that is not something that the agency feels they're able to do, then, or feels they might not have the authority to do, we're asking them to adopt a drinking water standard for PFAS as a class. And in the meantime, and while all this is going on, more sampling needs to be done. We need a statewide sampling plan that actually has a timeline of when the sampling is being done, when they hope to finish sampling at certain sites, because everywhere that sampling has been done, and this is across the country, this is not just a problem in New England, it's not just a problem in Massachusetts, but when states and investigators, federal investigators as well, have gone out to sample for the contaminants, they're finding it everywhere. It's really scary. So what is a safe limit for PFAS? And there's lots of studies out there contemplating different standards, but CLF and Toxics Action as well recommends the standard be at 1 part per trillion for any of these PFAS contaminants. So anytime that we're finding that the result of testing comes to above 1 part per trillion, there needs to be some sort of treatment happening. And what are these treatment technologies? Where again, this is something that is being contemplated by a number of scientists out there. There are some really educated individuals working on this, coming up with new treatment technologies, as we speak. There's a number of studies. These all need to be reviewed. There's experts to talk to. Conservation Law Foundation just had an excellent conversation with an expert from Harvard yesterday. And then what needs to happen, and we understand that this is going to cost some money for the drinking water suppliers. We need to look at the cost assessments of those best technologies to deal with PFAS. What's really important throughout this public health crisis is keeping the public aware, and this hearing, of course, is one step towards that, towards keeping the public aware. The transparency that we want regarding the statewide sampling will be incredibly helpful, so that individuals are aware across the state where sampling is happening, how soon it's happening. And then we want communication from MassDEP to the communities that could be at risk of PFAS exposure. Sometimes, things are pushed under the rug a little bit, or there doesn't, no one wants to create major public alarm, but it's extremely important that when there is a high level of PFAS in drinking water, that alternative drinking water sources are provided, and the public is generally aware that they should not be drinking the water. In addition, there are PFAS contaminated sites all over the state. What are the remediation plans for those sites? Again, we're talking about making sure everyone knows about any alternative drinking water sources, and then what's the cleanup strategy and the timeline on that strategy for cleanup. And as we're talking about today, the actual standards that MassDEP sets, those are important for the public to be aware of, and it sounds like this will continue to be a process throughout the years regarding different PFAS contaminants, so continuously updating the public on the changes that are made, whether it's guidelines, whether it's an actual MCL, whether it's an actual treatment technique that is chosen for dealing with PFAS. And finally, everyone has already talked a little bit about the AFFF concerns that we have. This is the firefighting foam, and that being a major source of PFAS contamination. This is also being found nationwide at the airports, the military bases, and any firefighting training sites. This is a big deal right now down on the Cape, and we do understand that most states are starting to collect and incinerate firefighting foam, but where is it being incinerated? Exactly how is it being incinerated? One concern that Jen and I have regarding incineration is that it has to be done at an extremely high temperature. It has to be done at facilities and incineration facilities that we trust and that have been responsible and have not been violating any other environmental standards. So that incineration, the public needs to understand exactly where that's happening, how it works, because further water contamination and air contamination can occur if it's not done properly. And now I'll pass it on to Shana from Toxics Action Center. I appreciate everyone coming today. It's great to have this big turnout.
Hi everyone. My name is Shana Casper. I'm the Water Program Director with Toxics Action Center. Toxics Action Center, we believe that everyone has the right to breathe clean air, to drink clean water, live in a healthy community with a government that operates responsibly and democratically, and we envision a toxic-free world where we phase out harmful chemicals from manufacturing, and we do everything possible to clean up the toxic legacies of our past mistakes. And just judging by everyone here at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday, I know that I'm not alone in this vision. So thank you guys, all so much for coming out. However, chemical companies have exploited these loopholes in our country's Safe Drinking Water Act for decades, meaning that most communities are not required to test for these chemicals, much less to clean them up. And there's no national enforceable drinking water standard for any PFAS, leaving such regulations up to the states. And these chemicals, as we talked about, used to make everything from Gore-Tex fabrics to firefighting foams, Teflon pans, other high-end coatings, are highly toxic, even in extremely small amounts, and have been linked to kidney disorders, cancers, reproductive disorders, immune system problems, and more. And that's why we're all here and why we're all so concerned. So working on the ground and in person with communities in Massachusetts and across New England, who were waking up to find out that the water coming out of their tap was not safe to drink and likely hadn't been for years, we actually started getting deluged with calls from communities all across the country finding out that their water had also been polluted. And so at a national conference in Boston in June of 2017, community leaders were inspired by new ideas to win on their local fights and wanted to collaborate and to make change beyond their backyard. And so that's why they launched the National PFAS Contamination Coalition. So the National PFAS Contamination Coalition is made up of community leaders from 25 community groups from 15 states and Guam who joined together to share information, gain skills, connect with experts, and worked on state and national campaigns together for solutions and to build a collaborative and powerful force to take on big polluters. And the coalition envisions a PFAS-free world where people are not exposed to PFAS, where poisoned people's health is protected, where there's justice for harms and deaths from past exposure, and where regulations change so that nothing like this can happen again. And you'll hear some of these really incredible, powerful, and personal stories from folks about their frustrations, their hurt, their anger later on. There are no federal or state drinking water standards for PFAS. And without standards, there's no requirements for communities to test for PFAS or to clean them up. And so that's why Toxics Action Center and Conservation Law Foundation filed this petition calling on the state to set strong new standards for drinking water to protect the public's health. So first, as we had said, we must treat PFAS as a class. There's 5,000 different kinds of PFAS chemicals, potentially even many more, and regulating each one individually would take decades. And scientists say that these chemicals pose similar health risks due to their chemical structure. And so MassDEP must take action now to protect further harms to Bay Staters from this regrettable substitutions that we've been seeing. Second, MassDEP should set a treatment technique drinking water standard that will limit PFAS to health protective levels, including for those for infants, children, and the most vulnerable populations. And as you heard, we suggest 1 part per trillion for all PFASs. We need to remove unsafe levels for these toxic chemicals from Massachusetts drinking water thoroughly and safely. The Massachusetts DEP should also require public water systems to use, obviously, safe water supply when PFAS are detected. And so, yeah, I mean, this chart is thanks to Silent Spring Institute, just showing the steep decline of these of the regulations through the in other states through the years, and just you can notice that obvious curve. And also, as we had said, we need strong regulations to require more testing and to remediation. PFAS has been found in the water of over 500,000 families across the U.S. in recent years, including in Ayr, Barnstable, Hyannis, Yarmouth, Westfield, Devon, Danvers, Hudson, Sherburne, Bedford, Weymouth, Martha's Vineyard. And the Environmental Working Group, EWG, estimates that PFAS are in the drinking water of 110 million Americans. Bay Staters deserve to know that the water we drink is safe from these toxic chemicals, and MassDEP has a chance to set a standard that will protect people across the state to take care of this crisis at once. And so across the country and here in Massachusetts, we're facing this drinking water crisis. And Massachusetts just cannot afford to wait. We need to regulate PFAS as a class. We need to enforce health protective standards for 1 part per trillion for total PFAS. And we need strong regulations to spur more testing because we know that these chemicals are just about everywhere. Thank you guys all again so much for coming. I really want to encourage folks to share their stories who are here. And thanks for hearing me out.